Good evening. You're watching CNBC-TV18 with me, Parikshit Luthra. Now, what we're looking at is a big diplomatic weekend. In fact, this entire week is full of geopolitics. Three big events lined up over the next 3 days, and this could be really pivotal for trade and political relationships of important global powers. First up, the G7 summit, and all global papers are saying this is likely to be the most acrimonious G7 ever. This is going to take place in Quebec, and Canada is set to kick it off, and it promises to be feisty. Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau and France's Emmanuel Macron have been hitting out at Donald Trump over tariffs. We've been seeing a war of words as well play out. Macron has fired the warning shots over tariff imposed by the United States president, and the US president is also hitting back. The tariff tussle aside, Trump also has called on Russia to be included into the G7, putting him at odds with the others. 4 years ago, remember, Russia was removed from the then G8 grouping after it annexed Crimea in Ukraine. Trump will then fly from Canada to Singapore, and remember, this would take place when the G7 is already on. It's not over. They would be beginning discussions on oceans and climate change, but Trump won't be there for any of it. He would be heading to Singapore, where he's scheduled to meet the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. This is a summit we've all been waiting for. There have been a lot of flip-flops as well, but we'll keep our eyes on that. 12th of June is the date when the two leaders will be meeting. This is definitely historic. Another key event is the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Summit, which kicks off in Qingdao, China. Prime Minister Modi is set for bilateral talks with China's Xi Jinping, and this comes just 41 days after the Wuhan summit in China itself. Both leaders will try and take forward the consensus and review all the developments in trade that have taken place. Russia's President Vladimir Putin and Iran's Hassan Rouhani will also be there in attendance, and SCO clearly is taking place in the backdrop of US pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal and imposing sanctions on Russia. So clearly this will be a major talking point when all the leaders meet and sit together. Now, ahead of the SCO summit, I spoke to former Indian envoy to China, Ashok Kanta, on what could be the crucial talking points when Prime Minister Modi meets Xi Jinping. He also spoke about the trade deficit. Today, the trade deficit has doubled in the last 5 years. It stands at about $69 billion. And this really, ladies and gentlemen, is 39% of India's total trade deficit. Let's play out that interview.
Though trade expanded last year, so did our trade deficit. It increased from $51 billion to $63 billion, which accounts for 39% of global trade deficit, which is clearly not sustainable. Our exports also increased marginally, about 10%, but our imports from China increased by nearly 25%. So this has resulted in a situation which is causing concern, not only in terms of economic engagement, but it's creating a degree of negativity in wider public discourse on China. I believe there is need to take urgent measures to ensure that we have more balanced economic engagement in India and China. This will call for a multi-pronged approach.
Right. How do you think the Prime Minister can urge the Chinese leadership to do that? Because it seems that China is also tying this up to India's non-participation in the Belt and Road Initiative.
I will not like to link up the two issues. I believe we have conveyed very clearly at the highest level that the present trade deficit is not sustainable, and understand the Chinese side appreciates this problem. It's a structural issue. It will require, as part of solution, steps on part of both sides. For one thing, I believe China needs to give much better market access for goods and services where we have competitive advantage. For instance, Indian pharma, agro products, buffalo meat, IT services, the whole lot of products and services where we are able to sell in other advanced markets, but we are facing market barriers in China.
All right, so what can we really expect when Prime Minister Modi meets Xi Jinping once again? Because we've got this huge trade deficit with China, and this comes at a time when all regional partners are pushing India into signing the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Can India really address the issue of trade deficit. With such a massive trade deficit, it would be counterproductive for India to sign such a deal. Joining us this evening, we've got Inar Tanjan, commentator, economic affairs. He's joining us from Beijing. We also have Meera Shankar joining us from London. She's India's former ambassador to the US. We also have Ambassador Anil Trigunath, who was a former envoy to Jordan. I'm going to begin with Anil Trigunath here. Ambassador Trigunath, when Prime Minister meets Xi Jinping, and this is a meeting that's taking place just 41 days after Wuhan, what can we really expect? Because there is this $69 billion trade deficit that everyone is now talking about. Can we expect the Prime Minister to make this point very clearly and squarely with the Chinese president?
No, you are absolutely right. I mean, the trade deficit is a major concern, but trade is always a two-way street, as you know. And this is, I believe that this has been discussed earlier also, and we have arrived at this Wuhan consensus. And as you know, only day before yesterday, there was a meeting between the foreign secretaries of India and they discussed about the agenda of the bilateral meeting that will be held apart from the overall SCO discussions. And I believe that in this particular thing, Prime Minister will definitely convey. And I'm quite sure, as you played out Ambassador Kanta's interview, that there are various areas where there are non-tariff barriers and market access barriers. They need to be somehow addressed by the Chinese, and I think that the Chinese will be willing to come out because they're also looking at investing greatly in India, and they also complain about some barriers to their entry as far as investments are concerned. So it's a two-way trade, and both sides will continue to work. However, I would like to say something more important in this would be, apart from the bilateral interactions, would be the overall SCO format in which India is participating along with Pakistan for the first time as a full member partner, yes. And this is also happening at a time when both US has problems both with China, with Russia and with Iran. So therefore it's an extremely important time that the
I'm going to come to that,
are happening,
Ambassador
Qingdao and Quebec, yes.
But we really want to focus on that point about trade deficit for the moment. Yeah, in our tangent, yes, we're looking at a scenario where several partners who are negotiating the RCEP are putting pressure on India to sign it as soon as possible. But how can India sign the RCEP when there is such a massive trade deficit with China? And do you think that President Xi Jinping would be willing to start opening up the market, the Chinese market, to more of exports from India? This is not a new problem. In the last 5 years, the trade deficit with China has doubled.
Well, quite frankly, I think China is not only willing but prepared and has plans to open up its markets to India. As you know, when he started in 2013, Xi Jinping said that India and China would define the new Asian century. And is this still something he believes? He's was willing very quickly to have this informal meeting at Wuhan. There's this Wuhan consensus. I completely agree with the ambassador. And it's a two-way street. The reason RCEP is important is because the only way that India is going to solve these trade balances is to become more connected. That means infrastructure, connecting these agricultural products into China so that they can get them there before they go bad. There has to be some investment actually in China in terms of developing industries. China has a tremendous number of industries that is no longer competitive to do in China itself. I use this example of 15-15-15. It's $15 an hour to employ a low-level person in the United States. It's $15 a day to employ somebody in China, and it's $15 a week to employ somebody in India. So India can take a lot of these.
If I could also ask you, there has been a lot of commentary. People are saying that when there is a trade war going on, US is all about America first. Donald Trump is pushing America's interests everywhere. It'll only be in China's interest to have closer trade ties, bilateral economic ties with India.
Well, I think long before there was a trade war, I think China was expressing a desire to get closer to India. Remember, India and China together are the fastest growing segment of the world. They represent the markets for which, although the West still has the money, of overwhelming wealth, 60%. However, they have nowhere to grow it.
Yeah.
Their fields are growing very slowly. The fields in China and India are growing quickly. Together, China and India would represent a new bargaining table where they would be sitting as equals as opposed to being dictated to.
All right, I'm going to go across to Ambassador Meera Shankar. Ambassador Meera Shankar has been waiting patiently. This SCO summit meeting is taking place in the backdrop of US sanctions on Russia and US pulling out of the Iran deal. Interestingly, you'll have Vladimir Putin there, you'll have Hassan Rouhani, and all partners, all SCO partners have been affected by US sanctions on Russia. So do you think this will be a part of the discourse very, very strongly, Ambassador Shankar, because we're also getting to know from our sources in the Russian government that Vladimir Putin is going to make this point very, very clear that one country can't dictate to others who they should have military and diplomatic ties with?
I think there are several issues on the agenda of the SCO summit. An important issue from India's point of view is the issue of terrorism and extremism, which will figure high on the SCO summit. The other is the institutions of global governance and how do you strengthen international institutions, including trade, rather than, engage in unilateralism. And of course, all major security issues will be on the table, but and Iran certainly, because both China and Russia have been signatories to the agreement, the nuclear agreement with Iran, and are in favor of its continuance. But from what we hear, they don't want this issue, the Iran issue, to be the dominant theme of the summit. So there there's likely to be some kind of a declaration that they expect all partners to adhere to the nuclear agreement. But the primary forum that they will use is the P5+1, which was the forum which negotiated the deal.
P5+1.
Yeah, so that would be Europe, really, because Russia and China will coordinate with Europe on this issue, where the US to some extent stands isolated, because Europe also wants the deal to continue. So there are some nuances between the countries as to whether they would like to explore the possibility of expanding it to other areas, to which, of course, the Iranians have absolutely refused to go along. Interestingly, as the SCO summit is meeting, you have, on the other hand, the G7 summit in Canada.
The G7.
Where, there is a sharpening of rhetoric over trade issues between Canada and Europe on the one hand, and the United States on the other. At the moment, it doesn't look as though either of them is seeking a consensus. And both the EU and Canada have imposed counter tariffs on US tariffs on their exports.
It's very interesting, isn't it, Ambassador Meera Shankar? I'm sorry, I'll interrupt you there, because we're going to be looking at G7 and the North Korea-US summit, the June 12th summit that's going to take place in a few days. We'll be looking at that after the break, but you're raising a very important point. The US sanctions will be there on everyone's mind when the SCO summit is taking place. They may not talk about it in detail. And at the same time, you will have countries like Canada and also France up against the United States at the G7. But coming back to Ambassador Trigunayat and focusing on the SCO summit once again, we are picking up that Prime Minister Modi will make a strong pitch against terror, but will not make it Pakistan-centric. What do you think will be India's pitch at the SCO? Very quickly.
You see, the SCO is, the terrorism is one of the major strands because of which SCO came all about. And we have always consistently mentioned and talked about terrorism, and especially the Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, even if it is not named per se, but everybody knows that that is one country with which we are there. And as far as terrorism is concerned, I think there is a consensus in the SCO that these this has been seen in the previous statements also. And I don't know if there will be a pull-aside meeting between the President of Pakistan and Prime Minister, or there will be any formal meeting, which is not planned as yet. But definitely those issues are going to be talked about, and China has also come around on those. Russia is already with us, and all the bilateral statements, informal summits, terrorism has figured very prominently. So terror and terrorism and trade are the two very major issues that India is going to flag there.
All right. We're also hearing that the Prime Minister will respect that multilateral forum. He is going to focus on connectivity and greater economic ties. And the sources in the government are, for the moment, denying the possibility of a bilateral with Pakistan. Don't go anywhere. We'll request all our guests to stay with us. When we return after a short break, we'll discuss what's going to happen at the G7 in Quebec. And we'll also discuss the Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump summit, which everyone has been talking about.